my presentation specifically will be about how to speak in the public arena and to journalists. So, first of all, I wanted to introduce the word advocacy and the concept of advocacy, because it's a word that we're using a lot at UISG these days, but it's a word that's sometimes a little difficult to define. So I wanted to start with that definition. What is advocacy? Well, the Merriam-Webster Dictionary online defines advocacy as the act or process of supporting a cause or a proposal. And in international development, which is the field I've worked in before joining UISG, really that means that advocacy is any work that we do to speak up for the needs and for the rights of marginalized or vulnerable groups. And of course, it's also the work that we do to empower those people and those communities so that eventually they can speak up for themselves. Now, UISG has an advocacy statement. This statement is something of a work in progress, so it's not a final version. But I think it's interesting to share it today so that you can have an idea as well of what we're talking about here at UISG when we talk about advocacy. And this is our advocacy statement as it stands. We are your sisters. We are committed to advocating for you and together with you, sharing a journey of care for people and for the environment. We believe in a world where everyone experiences a sense of their own human dignity. And we build our vision and mission on evidence from our work on the ground. So, what is the advocacy project that Uta and I are working on? This project is called Religious Sisters Advocating Globally for Human Dignity and the Earth. And as we said in our statement, these are really the two pillars of our advocacy, the two areas in which we'll be advocating for human dignity, so that everyone experiences a sense of their human dignity in the world, and for the care of our common home. This project has three main objectives: an objective around communication, an objective around training, and an objective around networking. Our first objective is improving recognition of the work of women religious towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, the UN Goals for International Development, working towards the year 2030. That's our goal for communications. Our goal for training is building the capacity of sisters to advocate on issues that affect the world's most marginalized and most vulnerable communities. And our objective for networking is to create spaces that are convened by women religious for dialogue on key development issues. Now, many of you will know about this project already, of course, because many of you took part in the pilot campaign for this project, which was launched at the end of September and was called You Are My Sister. The campaign, which many of you volunteered to take part in, and we are so grateful for that and for your contribution to the huge success that the campaign was in the end. The campaign aimed to highlight the work of sisters to serve some of the most vulnerable communities in the world during the COVID-19 pandemic. This campaign highlighted stories of sisters from 4 countries in the end, from Kenya, from India, from Brazil, and from Cambodia. And the videos for this campaign were viewed almost 18,000 times in total. So we managed to reach a lot of people. And it also led to some really interesting media engagements, with journalists and with online media platforms. And in fact, today's session is partly built on learnings from that experience and from those engagements. So I just want to say thank you again to everyone who took part. So I think we're ready finally to actually get started. I just wanted to run you through what we're going to do today. So my presentation will be on how to speak in the public arena and to journalists. After that, we'll have a question and answer session to clarify the presentation, to expand on anything that you'd like to hear more about. Then we will have a mock interview with Sister Jessica Salvagna, who is hopefully joining us from Cambodia today. I haven't seen her yet, but she should be with us, to talk about the role of sisters in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, and a moment of reflection as well on that interview, what we can learn from watching someone else be interviewed. If we have time, we will also have space for some learning and sharing, for an open discussion on experiences of engaging with the media and insights that we might want to share. And finally, we will have some space for feedback, for comments and for suggestions. So without further ado, I think we're ready to start. The first thing that I want to talk about today is the media landscape. Now, I think we all know that we live in a world where the media landscape has changed enormously over the last 5, 10, 20 years. And that speed of change is accelerating every day. The media landscape is constantly changing. So it's very hard really to describe what it's like to engage with the media today, because new technologies, new ways of sharing information are constantly changing the way that we engage with the media. But I think there are a few things that we can usefully think about if we've been asked to take part in an interview, for example. So the first thing to remember, and I will give us a few examples in just a moment, but the first thing to remember is that the media landscape is a very crowded space today. So if you don't tell your story, somebody else will. And for those of us who are not used to speaking up about our work, perhaps, or about our experiences, I think this is a really key point. There are thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of voices out there accessing the online platforms that have made information sharing so easy and so immediate. And if you don't talk about the story that you want to share, someone else will talk about it, and they may not talk about it as you would. They may not represent you in the way that you want to be represented, or showcase your work in the way that you would showcase it. So first of all, the media landscape is very crowded today. Secondly, it moves at extremely high speed. We live in the era of the 24-hour news cycle. We are constantly being bombarded with new information. So if you want to share your story, then speak now or forever hold your peace. The news cycle moves incredibly quickly. What is relevant today will be forgotten tomorrow. At the same time, and this might seem like a contradiction, but it's not really a contradiction, it's just a paradox. At the same time, you are always and forever on record. In the digital era, anything that you say can and will be used against you in the future, because everything that you say is on record, potentially forever, and can be found by anyone with access to the internet. So it's true that what you say is here today, gone tomorrow. It holds the attention of the media, of the news cycle for a very, very brief amount of time, but it also never quite disappears. And finally, sensationalism. We've all heard about, talked about fake news and misinformation, and I think it's really important to remember that a gripping story travels faster than anything else, however true and however important. And that's something that really has never been more relevant today and more relevant this year when we think about all the misinformation around the pandemic than it ever has been before. So a few examples. In August 2019, a man called Matthew Harris tweeted, "EasyJet beats Ryanair to have backless seats." And his tweet shows a photo of a woman sitting on an airplane seat with no back. He has hashtagged, so he is also speaking to the International Air Transport Association and the EU Aviation Safety Agency. And he says, "This is flight 2021 Luton to Geneva. How can this be allowed?" And again, he hashtags Geneva Airport, the EasyJet press account on Twitter, and EasyJet themselves. Now, EasyJet responded to this immediately, saying, "Hi, Matthew. Thanks for bringing this to our attention. before we can investigate this, could I ask you to remove the photograph and then direct message us more information regarding this so we can best assist you? From someone called Ross. Now, do you think Matthew Harris took down his photo of someone sitting on a seat with no back? Of course, he did not. What happened instead is that his tweet was shared almost 30,000 times, liked almost 45,000 times, and generated 2,800 comments. So I think what we can take from this story is that EasyJet made a crucial mistake in this situation. They thought that they could shut down that conversation. They thought that they could take control of that conversation by asking Matthew Harris to postpone any comments until they had worked out what was going on. But of course, that's just not possible today. Once a story is out there, you can't take it back. The space is crowded and everybody is crying out to be heard. So I think it's really important to remember that when your time comes to share a story, you have to be out there kind of expressing it in your own words and making your side of the story, your version of the story be heard. Otherwise, someone else will show you in a different light. Second example, the high-speed news cycle. I think this comic, which is from the New Yorker, pretty much speaks for itself. We are all so saturated with new information all of the time that we cycle through this feeling of what's new, what's going on, and then we kind of encounter the surprise, perhaps, at something in the news, the feeling of dismay. It's often not good news, especially this year. A lot of the news has not been good news. We feel horrified, but as humans, we are not really programmed to feel emotionally exhausted by the news all of the time. At some point, we have to let it go. We have to move on. And so that's where the news cycle starts again. We resign ourselves to whatever was in the news yesterday, we forget about it, and we move on to the next thing. Now, you are on record. So in June 2014, Donald Trump, soon to be former president of the United States of America, tweeted, "Are you allowed to impeach a president for gross incompetence?" At the time, of course, he wasn't talking about himself, but this tweet became very funny, very ironic, and gained huge traction, was shared again by hundreds of thousands of people when the president himself was impeached in December 2019. What's important to remember here, and you can see my second example under kind of thinking about being on the record, what's important to remember is that it's not just what you have said, which is always on record, but also what has been said by people or by organizations that might be associated with you. So in October 2011, almost 10 years ago, Trump Hotels, the chain of hotels owned by the family of Donald Trump, tweeted an apparently innocuous, apparently innocent publicity message. And their message was, "Tell us your favorite travel memory. Was it a picture, a souvenir, a sunset? We'd love to hear it." Now, this came back to haunt Trump Hotels and Donald Trump himself when the president initiated his policy of travel bans in 2017. And somebody replied to this tweet by Trump Hotels saying, "My favorite travel memory is that time I fled communist Romania to a refugee camp in Austria, came to America, and years later became an executive at Google, creating tens of thousands of jobs." So I think it's really important to know when we're entering the media space, what it is that we have said in the past, but also what has been the position of organizations, of people that we are or have been associated with as well. And finally, sensationalism, and this is really the one that's perhaps most relevant in 2020. This is a message that was shared on Facebook, and it says, "The 5G antenna is a threat to humanity. It is a more advanced technology to control the entire world. Now we are facing compulsory vaccination containing microchips, and lies are being told that it's for coronavirus. Everything depends on us. We must all say no to the 5G antenna. Now, conspiracy theories about 5G, the information technology, and its possible association with the health threat that we're all facing with the coronavirus pandemic have been spreading across the internet like wildfire and have led to some really serious real-world damage. For example, antenna being burned to the ground by people who had been persuaded by these conspiracy theories. This particular post was shared almost 9,000 times. And I think that really gives us an idea of the threat of sensationalism. Again, once a story has been shared, it can't be unshared. And it's much more difficult to counteract that damage than to prevent it. So I think it's really important to know when we step into the media space, in what ways our story might be sensationalized and in what ways our story might be manipulated, might even be lied about to make it sound more exciting, more controversial, because unfortunately, that's what sells. So now that I have made the media landscape sound sufficiently scary, I thought we might take a more reassuring look at what I like to call the media transaction. The transaction that you are entering into when you meet a journalist for an interview. Now, I think the key thing to remember is that we are all at risk of succumbing to the imposter syndrome. And when I say we, I mean especially we as women. We all know that feeling that we are not good enough to be here, that there's been some kind of mistake, that perhaps we've been overestimated, that people don't realize how little we know, that people don't realize the skills or the knowledge that we're lacking. So I think the first thing to do when you think about the transaction that you enter into when you meet a journalist for an interview is to fight that imposter syndrome. You are here and you have been invited to speak because you are the expert. And the really key thing to remember is that you are more expert than the journalist. The journalist can be intimidating. Perhaps they have a fancy looking microphone and lots of technological equipment. Perhaps they've flown in from another country, and that's a little intimidating too. Perhaps they're very confident. Of course they are. They're well practiced at public speaking. But you are the expert on this subject, and that's why you have been invited to speak. As well as remembering that you are the expert, I would say it's really important to remember that you create actual value. You create value that is both cultural and monetary. You have something that the journalist wants, which is a good story, and you have something that the journalist makes a living from. The journalist makes a living by selling your story, by sharing your story, and you want that story to be shared. So here we come to the third point, which I think it's useful to remember. A good interview happens in the space where you can reconcile your agenda, the story that you want to share, with the journalist's agenda, the type of story that they want to talk about. You and the journalist both have something to gain from an interview. You both have something to gain from this transaction. So the key thing is to find out where your interests align and how this can be of mutual benefit to you both. Now, I think it is important at this point to clarify that, of course, in an ideal world, the journalist as well would be approaching your interview as an opportunity to find mutual benefit. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. You may be faced with someone who is only out to pursue their own agenda, someone who is really ready to manipulate you and your story and perhaps your beneficiaries, the people that you have put them in contact with, to further their own agenda. So it is good to be aware that there can be manipulation involved where a journalist is perhaps not willing to meet you halfway, not willing to find that shared space. But I do think that it's really key to be positive about this transaction going into it, to be cautious but optimistic, to know that this is something that can be good for everyone involved. So, before the interview,